some ground to cover this evening, so let's go ahead and get started. I was handed a booklet concerning some of the topics that we were covering last week, particularly about volcanoes, and this one has to do with Mount St. Helens, and I thought I might just of statements made. It's one of these picture books. Children and grown-up children like to have. And you might find it interesting. You might want to look at it afterwards. Before I read you this, here's what the mountain looked like. So tranquil and serene before its top blew a couple of years ago. Pictures are fairly fascinating. You've probably seen some of these in magazines or on broadcast before. This is after it's, of course it went off several times before the final eruption, I think was May 18th. You can't see it from as far away as most of you are, but this is a picture of the crater of the volcano, a plane flying over it, and then in this picture you can see the helicopter going over the top of it. There's a plane in this picture that's just a dot there. Now that's how large the crater was that blew, and that was before the final eruption. And remember I said that they just simply annihilate things for miles and miles around. Looks like an atomic bomb, the smoke and debris and gases that's going out of the top of it. This other picture, people in Washington. Of course, this, remember, is back in Oregon in the Cascades. Same place where we discussed one of the volcanoes earlier. Same mountain range, the Cascades that run up the northwest, the Pacific coast there. So these people are all the way up in Washington State watching the volcano erupt. Of course, there's a lake by there known as Spirit Lake that's nothing. But this was 10 miles northwest. I don't know if you can see it, but this is logs, timber, looks like matchsticks blown over with the hurricane force winds that went through here. That's what all these little things are, just like little matchsticks, blew them over. Of course, it just devastates a region like that. Nothing grows there now, and nothing will for some time. Some of these pictures, they say, are in the president's office. Some more of the trees, and here's a car that got caught. Of course, you know what happened to the people there. Just like in an incinerator. They had a 10-mile radius around it, a warning zone called the red zone. But you know how people are. They want to get too close. As a matter of fact, it even has a picture, I couldn't believe it, of a couple of climbers. Again, you can't see them probably, but they are up looking in the crater. This is just before it went off. But there's a bright couple. You'd want to have them in the Oval Office there. This picture on this side. That's not faith. That's what they call in some faith circles foolishness. Be up looking over the crater. But anyway, it's got a couple of very interesting remarks here at the beginning. Just to compare the power of the volcano, they said it had the power of 50 ocean freighters, all full of TNT going off at the same time, or 500 times more powerful than the atomic bomb, one of the atomic bombs dropped in Japan, 1945, the end of World War II. 500 times more powerful than that atomic bomb, and this is one volcano. Says the cloud of gas and debris rose up 63,000 feet into the air. Remember, that's what we needed last time for the condensation nuclei. Went up 63,000 feet. Says a DC-9 commercial aircraft flying at 33,000 feet flew 4 minutes through the cloud of ash and was forced to land with clogged engines. It blew off almost 1,300 feet of its height. Then you've got all types of mudslides. All these logs went into the Toutle River, which is one of the rivers that empties some of the melting snow in that area. And these logs, of course, had come to the surface in the water, in the river, knocked out every bridge for 30 miles in this particular river. And the mud and the ash warmed the temperature of the river. And you know how cool or absolutely cold a mountain stream can be. The temperature was 90 degrees Fahrenheit of this river. Killed all the fish and so forth. Lightning, which resulted from the friction in the air, started 200 forest fires. There was enough, this is the important part, because what we were talking about last time concerned the ash and the dust from volcanoes. There was enough ash and dust to cover Manhattan Island to a depth of 28 stories. That's how much dust and ash came from the volcano. The most interesting part is the very end where they've got a little section called There Were Survivors. And I forget how many people died. 100, I guess, or so people died, but there were a few survivors that got out that were in that area, and it's amazing the story they have. Of course, they'd probably credit all of it to luck, but you may want to look at that. It's very interesting. We want to look tonight, we're still on the same subject of the physiographical effects of the flood, the effects that the flood has rendered upon the earth and its environment. We want to begin looking at some of these here this evening. We've looked already at some of the effects on man and animals. One of the first effects upon the earth that I've got listed on your outline is what I call viewing the earth from space. There's a change, or there was a change in the view that an individual would have of the earth if you were in outer space. You're familiar with some of the pictures been sent back by the astronauts, and or some of the, just pictures that have come either in magazines or over the TV from satellites or whatever the source, and generally, you've got, before I tell you that, you've got a view of the earth that's entirely different than what you would have seen prior to the flood. And what this leads us to understand are some of the changes that were affected on the earth's surface as a result of the flood. Now, prior to the flood, if you would have been an astronaut, or you had seen a picture that had been sent back, relayed back to the earth from a satellite, you would have seen really only two things. You would have seen, with minor obstructions in the view because of the water vapor canopy, you would have seen nothing but lush green vegetation, as well as brilliantly clear blue seas and oceans. And that really would have been all that you would have seen. You would have seen green and blue. Now, the brilliance, whether in the green or in the blue, would have been somewhat obstructed because of the water vapor canopy, but nonetheless, these two things would still have been what you see. Now, we've got at least three changes. If you are in outer space today looking down on the earth, first of all, the continents probably have a different layout and structure today than they did prior to the flood. Continents would have been different. Now, that doesn't mean that there have been as many changes as the one continent theorists say that there have been, where we've got Eurasia and Gondwana land, and you've got a breakup of all the continents, they all hooked together at one time. No, that was probably not true. We've got someone up here that's coming through the front. Where was I? Oh, the continents. But we've got a different layout of what the continents would be. Now, I can say more about that in a moment. Secondly, another thing that's very noticeable whenever you see pictures from outer space are the white spots on the earth. And you find them in two places, the top of the earth and the bottom of the earth. Of course, those are known as our polar caps. You don't see anything there but white. Now, you look at a picture from outer space next time, and you'll see this. Those huge white regions at the top and the bottom of the globe are the polar caps. Now, there's something, as far as the Earth is concerned, that the flood brought a difference in its environment, because if you had been in outer space prior to the flood, you wouldn't have seen any of these polar caps. Of course, the flood is what brought them on. And then thirdly, the reddish, dark brown regions that you now see from outer space that you wouldn't have seen then are the great deserts of the world. No vegetation grows there, or relatively none. And so when you have a look from outer space, you're going to still see some green. You'll see the blue oceans, but you'll also see a change in the layout of the continents. You'll see white polar caps in the Arctic region and the Antarctic region, as well as the large brown reddish regions which represent deserts, especially in North Africa, which is the Sahara Desert that is so tremendously large, which, by the way, at one time, they have proven by some of the remains, fossil remains that they have found in the desert, used to be covered by, of all things, green, plush vegetation. Didn't used to be a Sahara Desert there. It was just as plush as some of your tropical countries, where you've got a lot of vegetation and where you don't have a desert region like that. And that's been proven because they found that there. That's very interesting. Now, another effect is just the reverse of viewing the Earth from space, and that is viewing the space, the outer space region from the Earth. Now, you've got to remember, we have no idea of exactly how thick the water vapor canopy would have been. It's been estimated that it was probably around 40 feet thick. That would have constituted enough water, when you combine that with the breaking up of the fountains of the deep, to cover the whole globe to several thousand feet, enough water to cover the relatively small antediluvian mountains. Now, it's interesting that whenever you consider the position of the water vapor canopy, although, of course, water vapor is invisible, if you get 40 feet of it together, then guess what? That's going to obscure your view of outer space, which means that the sun would not have been nearly as brilliant as it is today, which also would have meant that there would not have been nearly as many stars visible to the naked eye in the pre-flood world as compared to today. Now, when you go back to Genesis 8 and the exit of Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, their 3 wives, you can imagine the amazement that they would have had on seeing the sun for the first time after the collapse of the water vapor canopy. You see, prior to that, you've seen it if you've been in L.A., it's kind of just a haze there. You see a ball there, but it's not round, really, because all the light is diffused as it passes through all of the smoke. Now, I've been to L.A., and I know what it looks like, and it's miserable. You wouldn't want to live in a place like that. And you certainly can't see any stars at night, not when there's any smog in the air. You certainly can't see any stars. Now, even if you haven't been to a place like L.A., we don't have the smog problems here, but just you can have it even during the daytime, where it's not really cloudy, it's just a haze that's hanging in the air. That's water vapor. And that haze that's hanging in the air obscures the sun, and sometimes you can't even, although it's not cloudy, as we would say, a cloud that passes in front of the sun and obscures its view, although it's not that, just the haze, even on a clear day, can sometimes make the sun completely disappear. You can tell, the region of the sky where it is because it's brighter than other regions, but you can't see a clearly defined orb in the sky. Now, probably they could not see that clearly defined orb prior to the flood either, because you've got 40 feet of water vapor hanging in the Earth's atmosphere. They exit the ark, and of course it's daytime then, and here, lo and behold, you've got a brilliantly yellow sun. And they'd probably never seen a red and orange sunset like we've seen, because when you get on the horizon, it's like looking through water. that distorts the view. I mean, if you look through water and try to aim something like if you're spear fishing, you can't throw the spear at the fish because it's really not there. Because you see, water acts like a prism. It bends light. And that's why if you're spear fishing, you have to become accustomed to where the fish is in relation to where you see the fish to be, because it's not there. And you've got to gauge your throw at just the right spot so you'll get the fish. Now, the same principle is true as far as the sunset is concerned, because with that position, with it going up on the horizon, it distorts a person's view, and even back then it would have distorted the view, and you certainly wouldn't have had any of the color that we see in the sky. Now, at sunset on their first day, with all of the moisture that would have been in the air from the flood, again, you're going to have, for the first time, a brilliant sunset. When night came, there are those thousands and thousands of bright shining stars that they had probably never seen prior to that. And so Shem, Ham, and Japheth would have, of course, they would have been the only ones, excluding, their wives, Noah and his wife, who would have known what it looked like prior to the flood. Only living people left. So they're the only ones that would know the transformation that had come. Consequently, it probably made a profound impact upon them. And no doubt they would have passed this down to their children and to their grandchildren and so forth. And this is probably why we've got such an early occult sin known as the worship of the sun. Because for the first time it becomes the god of the sky. It had not been that prior to this time. And along with that, you've got the worship of the stars, which we're still doing today, and we call it astrology today. And probably if any of the sons would have been responsible for that, it would have been Ham, since he's the one, through his son Canaan, that turns out to be the wicked of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, of Noah's three sons. It probably would have been passed down through Ham. And you've got there at the very beginning, or very early after the flood, the beginning of the worship of the sun, known as the sun worship, and the worship of the stars, known as astrology. Now, we'll show you more about that whenever we get over to chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel, because you've all heard about the Tower of Babel, but no one really knows anything about the Tower of Babel. You just remember it from picture books in Sunday school. There was a big tower that men foolishly were trying to build all the way up to God's heaven so they could visit God. And that's not even what the Bible says. It's not even what the Bible implies there, if you can read Hebrew, or if you can get someone who can and give you a good translation of what it says over in chapter 11. So we'll be sharing with you when we get over there some interesting things here in the same area of the worship of the heavenly bodies as far as the Tower of Babel is concerned. All right, another area where we would see changes would be in the geophysical alterations of the Earth's surface by hydrostatic forces of water. Now, this is what brings a kink into the theory of uniformitarianism. That's why we're going to spend a little bit of time on it here this evening and give you some examples of the hydrostatic power and force that water has behind it. Because if you're believing in a universal flood, which I assume you wouldn't still be coming here if you didn't believe in that, then one of the most profound effects it would have would be in its geophysical relationship to the earth. Viewing space from the earth and the earth from space, you might not have thought of those. You might not see the importance of that, but surely everyone has thought of the tremendous geophysical changes that would have been brought in the earth, and surely everyone would see the importance of that. Now, what I mean by that, of course, is the rearrangement of the crust of the earth's surface to get in line with hydrostatic forces and hydrology rather than uniformitarianism. Now, I've got a list, like we did last week, of volcanoes, this time of great devastation that water has brought, various time periods, in tsunamis and tidal waves, cyclones, hurricanes, seaquakes, earthquakes, and so forth. to give you an idea, you almost have to give examples like this, or when you talk about a tidal wave, you think, well, you know, a wave in the bathtub or something. If you've not lived in the Bay of Bengal on the eastern coast of India, you don't really know what waves can be. Now, you might have been to the Gulf of Mexico and seen a wave a couple of feet high, but that's still nothing compared to some of these great waves that come after some of these other phenomena of nature occur. Now, if you've been to Hawaii, the waves there can get larger because you're just in a place where the sea current and the air trends can bring the waves that the surfers want to get on and ride for some reason that I don't understand. One example, 1876. A wave swept across the Bay of Bengal. How many of you know where the Bay of Bengal is? All right. At least you didn't lie there. A couple of you raised your hand. Well, you can go home and look it up. That's in the Indian Ocean, though. And it's a place that's always getting hit by waves. It's just in the right place as far as the sea currents, the ocean currents, and as far as the wind currents are concerned. A wave swept across the Bay of Bengal, hitting the land, killing 200,000 people. Almost 250,000 people. 1876. 1883, last week, remember we talked about the explosion of Krakatoa? Well, in 1883, some of the waves from the explosion of Krakatoa were 100 feet high, traveling 450 miles an hour. When they hit the islands there, they killed 40,000 people. And when the waves got to Ceylon, some of them were still 2 feet high, that many miles away. Now, if we're out of your third grade expertise on geography, then you can go home and look these things up and they'll make sense to you. You know where Indonesia is, you know where India is, and Ceylon is an island in between the southern tip or the southeastern tip of India and the East Indies, now known as the Indonesian chain of islands. So one wave in 76 kills 200,000 people. Now we're just talking about one particular geographical location on one globe, and that's in the Bay of Bengal and the country of India, whereas in the Genesis account we're talking about these type of forces being unleashed all over the surface of the globe. Now that one wave there killed 200,000 people. People, of course, lying in the low regions, the coastal regions, that would have been inundated by the water. 1889. Of course, this is to our country the infamous Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood, where 20 million tons of water from a nearby lake, Conemaugh Lake, came over the banks and killed 2,200 people. Now that's a lot for a civilized country like ours, where you're supposed to have a corps of engineers that watches your dams and your dikes and your river banks and your flood stage levels of rivers and lakes and so forth. India, you don't have a lot of control over things like that. In this country, this is supposed to be an educated, civilized country, and when you're able to kill 2,200 people, why didn't they get those people out of there? We're talking about 20 million tons of water that came from this lake whenever the dam broke and went right through Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and just, of course, erased the city. Another example, 1937. This is when we had our great Ohio and Mississippi River floods, which destroyed $500 million worth of property and killed 400 people. And I happen to know a couple of people that were killed, at least indirectly, by this flood. That is the Ohio River flood. You know, Ohio's the northern boundary of Kentucky. I don't know them personally, but I know of them. And that's William Branham's wife and one of William Branham's children were killed by the great 37 Ohio flood. Because you see, the river goes right in between southern Indiana and northern Kentucky, where you've got where they used to live, Jeffersonville, Indiana, which is just across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. And his family, from what I remember of the count, they were not actually drowned or taken away by the water, but she had gone across the river to shop in Louisville and contracted some type of disease there, and with all of this flooding, it washed out their town, and he had to move his wife from one place to another. And Branham, by the way, was one of the ones working in the rescue squads to try to keep sandbags around the towns and help the people that they had found stranded. And so they were having to move his wife from one place to another. She ended up dying, and he had two little babies at the time, I think a baby girl and a baby boy. Both of them contracted pneumonia in the weather. Of course, when you've got water that overfloods like that, then you've got all types of diseases that set in if you don't watch out. You got to boil your water because of typhoid, because of some of the germs that you can pick up in the water. So there are a couple of people important that disappeared, and they were some indirect deaths, not part of the 400 that died in the flood. And so all these figures that I'm giving you are just people that died as an immediate result of the flood. Now, they died several weeks later as an indirect result of the flood. Branham's wife, and I think Branham's little daughter, little baby girl, was the one that died. That's another story on why they died and what happened, but obviously they didn't have the faith message, or things like that wouldn't have happened. His wife wouldn't have gotten whatever disease she got when she went shopping in Louisville. 1946. A wave from the Aleutian Island chain, which came as a result of a seaquake. Now, an earthquake is one, of course, that takes place on land. A seaquake, one at the bottom of the ocean. Traveled 470 miles an hour and hit the beaches of Hawaii with 19-foot waves. Now, Hawaii is a long way off from Alaska, where the Aleutian Islands are. So if you've traveled that far and you've still got waves 19 feet high when they hit the shore, then you've got quite a big seaquake that's caused it. 470 miles an hour that the water's traveling. 1963, getting a little more recent, an Italian flood killed 2,000 people in Italy in 6 minutes. Another example, May 1970. This is pretty tremendous. An avalanche of mud and water traveling 100 miles an hour came down the slopes of the Andes Mountains in South America and completely buried 2 Peruvian cities, killing 14,000 people. Now, I don't remember exactly what that was caused by, but nonetheless, you've got an avalanche of mud and water traveling 100 miles an hour as it comes down the side of the Andes Mountains, burying 2 cities in Peru, killing 14,000 people in the process. And of course, during the flood, you're going to have similar occurrences as far as the volume of water and the volume of mud is concerned, because you've got the fountains of the great deep breaking up as well as the windows of heaven opening. November of the same year, 125 mile an hour. So this is just baby winds in comparison to some of those other things. 125 mile an hour winds in the Bay of Bengal caused the waves to hit the shores 25 feet tall and killed 500,000 people. Now that was just, 13 years ago. Maybe you remember that, I don't know, but it was world news, because when something destroys 500,000 people, that's almost beyond comprehension that it could have killed that many people. Same place, same Bay of Bengal, same Indian country. And then 7 years later, to the same month, a cyclone hit that area in India. And of course, all of the rain and waves and water involved killed 80,000 people. November 1977. Now, I know about that because we had some friends and acquaintance who was in correspondence with some Indian Christians who lived in Machilipatnan, which is a little place on the eastern coast of India, not very far north of Madras, India. His name was Isaiah, by the way. And he was a young boy, but a spirit-filled Christian. And as a result, it completely annihilated their whole region there. And as a result, many of the children became orphans. They lost their parents, and some of them lost, all siblings as well as their parents. And they were a spirit-filled group of people there that we had been in touch with in letters. And we just felt that we had to help them. It was a Christian thing to do. They did not have the faith message. They didn't understand anything about faith, but they had the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And I don't remember exactly how long it went on, but for several years we helped the poor Christians that we knew of in that area. We couldn't go and help the whole country, but we knew of a pastor whose name was Parashuddha Babu, and his Isaiah was one of the children or one of the young men that was a part of his congregation. And as a result, we spent at least 3 years. Our church did, those that wanted to in the church. It wasn't any church program, but those that wanted to on their own spent, I think, at least 3 or 4 years helping them get back on their feet. And that's how long it took to get an orphanage built for the children and to get houses built for the Indians and to get clothes for them and to get food for them. You see, money is coming in by means of the Red Cross, but India is a Hindu country. And most of the money that comes in is going to go to the Hindus because, it's just like if you live in Utah. If Utah is a Mormon base and stronghold, which it is, then they have preference in the country because of the stronghold that their religion has in the country.
For the continual...
India is a Hindu country. And most of the money that comes in is going to go to the Hindus because, it's just like if you live in Utah. If Utah is a Mormon base and stronghold, which it is, then they have preference in the country because of the stronghold that their religion has in the country. The same thing is, or in the state. The same thing is true in India with the Hindus and their caste system ruling the country. Christians, and especially not ones baptized in the Holy Spirit, maybe some Baptists there, but not Spirit-filled Christians, are going to get any assistance from anyone like the Red Cross. And remember, don't criticize because they didn't know anything about faith or healing or really anything. All they had done is follow Jesus in salvation and in the baptism of the Holy Spirit and baptism of water, but the wrong way in water because they had learned it the wrong way from someone. And someone from our church ended up going over there and baptizing all of them correctly and teaching them the faith message so that we could stop sending finances. Not that we were tired of sending finances, but God doesn't call you to support your next-door neighbor forever and ever. You help him get back on his feet, and then if a man doesn't work, don't let him eat. But you've got a lot of orphans that can't do any work. They're just children. And anyway, the pastor, Parashuddha Babu, had 10 orphans besides his own family that he was raising anyway. So I think he had gone beyond the call of duty to begin with. He already had a big family like the Indians do, and then he had 10 orphans that he was raising with his own money and his own support besides that. So we helped them out until they got an orphanage built for the children. They had nowhere else to live. And until they got back on their feet. Now this, what did I give you a figure? 80,000? That's still relatively small. If you want to compare it to the 7 years prior to that, 500,000 people killed. Now these are just some examples of the force that water has, especially in regard to human life. Now what do you think it would have been like in Noah's day? It wouldn't have taken very long to take care of the whole population of the planet. If some of these localized storms and localized cyclones and hurricanes and seaquakes and waves and winds which result therefrom could have done that type of damage, then what do you think could have been done when all the fountains of the great deep broke up and the windows of heaven let loose their water? There's a particular type of sea phenomenon known as a tsunami, T-S-U-N-A-M-I. And this is the most powerful force that we have as far as weather is concerned, a tsunami, which it's really not a tidal wave. A tidal wave is something different than a tsunami, but a tsunami can travel at speeds of 525 miles an hour. It's a wave in the ocean that's caused by a seaquake that can travel at the speed of 525 miles an hour. When it hits shore, the sound of that can be heard as far as 20 miles away. Just a wave beating against the shore can be heard 20 miles away, and the mist which springs up as a result of the wave hitting the shore has been known to go as high as a 200-foot lighthouse. Now remember, this is all what we needed to have going on as far as hydrostatic processes are concerned during the flood period. And one thing that's interesting about a tsunami, as well as most of these other waves, they do not reach their tremendous height until they either reach shallow water or land, whichever comes first. I mean, sometimes you've got shallow water for a long region and no land there, but it'll still reach these tremendous heights. I'm talking like 50 feet high. Now that's several story building 50 feet high that a wave can reach. But what I'm saying is it's interesting to realize that when these waves do reach that height, it's not until they either get near land, up against the land, or in shallow water, which presents no problem with Noah's Ark being out on the middle of all this, because they just have to have land or shallow water before they reach these heights. Now they can still have the speed, and they still do have the speed, 500 miles an hour out in the middle of the ocean. But they're not going to reach the height of being 50 feet high, which would pretty much have overcome Noah's Ark if the waves had been able to reach him. But they wouldn't have, because he would have been out in the middle of the water. Now the reason that I've given you this is because of the geophysical alterations that would have resulted. When you consider some of our natural formations like Mammoth Caves in Kentucky, Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, and if you don't or haven't heard of those, you've all heard of the Grand of all the canyons in Arizona. What do you think caused these things? You see, those that explore in caves have a lot of theories on the dripping of water in some underground stream millions of years ago that worked its way through Mammoth Caves and left us with this tremendous cavern. And I've been to Mammoth Caves before, and it's tremendous that you can have that large of an underground vault. Caused by what, though? If it's caused by a river, it took several 100 million years to do it. And if the Colorado River is in fact what caused the Grand Canyon, took several 100 million years, which is what most people say and believe. And if you ask them what caused the Grand Canyon, well, the Colorado River does. Because as we began sharing with you last time, you know the force that moving and running water can have. We gave you the example of a dripping faucet on concrete. That all it takes is a small amount of water, as long as it's persistent, more persistent than most Christians in their faith and prayers, then it will work its way right through a piece of concrete. But remember, that's only one drop of water, and it's only one piece of concrete, and it'll probably only make an indentation about an inch deep. We're talking about a canyon that's 1 mile deep. The Grand Canyon's 5,000 feet deep. 25,000 feet across. Now, an inch is one thing. For water over, 10 years to bore an inch hole in concrete. Don't quote me on that. I don't know what the statistics are. But I know it's not going to bear an indentation 5,000 feet into something. Unless if you've got 100 million years, well, sure, the Colorado River could do that. It could do just about anything whenever it wants to. You begin to flood that region and begin to let those waters loose, and it'll cut its way right through bedrock and everything. But it has to have time. Now, if the earth is not as old as most people believe it, then we've got to come up with another theory for the formation of all of these fabulous earth features that we have. And that theory is more than a theory, it's a fact of earth history and a fact of Scripture, and that is the hydrostatic power and force of water. Now, why in a particular region does it cause that? Well, you could ask 1,000 questions on Why was a volcano here rather than there? That's just where, by earth processes, it happened to come up. But with something like Mammoth Cave, sure, you've got something happening in that region that caused a cave like that, but it's not over a process of millions or billions of years. It's over a process of 371 days that caused a cave like that, or a canyon like the Grand Canyon. We've been to the Grand Canyon back in the 60s. I remember we took a family vacation, and it's in Arizona. And when we were there was so much moisture in the air that it was kind of like looking over the banister of heaven at the clouds below, because you couldn't see anything. You look over the rim of the canyon and you couldn't see anything but what looked like a lot of clouds. Now, of course, it wasn't actually clouds. It was just water mist and haze in the air that had come up from the Colorado River, and we couldn't even see the bottom. We were going on one of those mule pack trains down to the bottom, but it was just the weather was too bad to go down, and we never did get to go down, never did really get to see it. But everyone has seen pictures of the Grand Canyon. And at its greatest depth, it's almost 1 mile deep, 25,000 feet across. And what that means, if the Colorado River bore that huge crevice, and now it's 25,000 feet across. Well, the Colorado River is just maybe 100 feet across. And that means if you start working your way backwards, let's fill all the land back in like it used to and get the Colorado River way back up on top of the earth like it used to be, then all it's going to do is bore, a 100-foot wide canyon there. And then over a process of millions and millions of years, of course, water's going to be running down the sides, and you're going to bring more and more of the sides into the canyon with you. But can you imagine how long it's going to take for 25,000 feet across? That's 5 miles. Across 5 miles, that's a long way. Just try walking. You'll realize how far 5 miles is, and that's how far across it is. Makes you wonder about people that want to jump over things like that in motorcycles. That was a long time ago. It took you a while to laugh because you had to think, motorcycle? Who was that? Well, yeah, it had a good name. That's a spirit that causes someone to do something like that. I don't know if one of the ones we gave you on the list from Sunday morning was a spirit of adventure or not, but if it isn't, it's one I've got on some future list. That's a spirit of adventure. You want to get out in those explorations of the unknown where no one's been before. And who's ever jumped over Snake River Canyon on a motorcycle before? So what do? Adventurous you wants to do that, but that's a demon that impels and controls someone to do something like that. Because with as many broken bones as he has ended up with, you'd have to have a spirit to want to go through with that all the time. As well as a lot of the other things, race car drivers, and a lot of other things where you end up always seeming to get hurt. Boxers, you've got a demon of violence. If you like being pounded on as well as pounding other people. That's a demon of violence that would want to do something like that. When your nose is broken by the time you're through with your career, at least a half a dozen times. And yet you go back in there all over again, and you're not, fighting for heavyweight money, $10 million or something. This is one of those Golden Glove amateur type things. You don't get anything for it, except a broken nose, or the pride that you can get when you deck your fella on the canvas. But that's another spirit, a spirit of pride. You can just run up or down the list either way you want to go, and you'll find people that are possessed with spirits whenever they want to harm their body. 1 Corinthians 3, you might want to look at it, not tonight or not now, but later. Don't destroy the temple of God. They say, well, I'm not a Christian, so my body's not the temple. Well, you can go ahead and destroy it then, because it's going to be destroyed later anyway. So either way you want to go, you still end up with 3 strikes against you. Now we come to another question as far as our physiographical studies are concerned, and that concerns the strata, what's known in geological circles as the strata, which is the deposition of various layers of the Earth's crust. You've got rocks and so forth mixed in with this, and the uniformitarian belief is that the deeper you go in the strata, then the older you're reaching back, the further you're reaching back into history. Now, dear friends, this is important because this is a universal belief. Everyone believes this. Because if you've ever buried something, you know that whatever's on top of it probably came there at a later time than what you buried there. And so when people try to take this back too far, they end up with uniformitarianism, that the deeper the strata, then the older the time period that you've reached. Therefore, if you find some bones down there, then you can date that on a pre-devised system. You've already devised a system that says, 10 feet down, I'm going to date it 100 years ago, 20 feet down, so forth. So you've already got a pre-devised system that no one can say anything against because you can't prove it, you can't disprove it. I mean, if you've already worked up the system, how can you actually prove that bone is 1,000,000 years old? Well, you can't. But you can set up a system and say, if it is 100 feet below the surface of the earth, then anything 100 feet below is going to be 1,000,000 years old. Well, anyone could invent your own system. You could say if it's 100 feet deep, then it's 2 years old. You can invent any system you want. So they have invented a stratigraphic system that tells you how old something is depending on how far down you find it, depending on how deep it is. Now, just the reverse of that is true. The nearer it is to the surface, then the younger the material and the age at which you date the material that you found. And people spend their lifetime digging down just as deep as they can dig, hoping they can get to something older, because they think the deeper I get, the older it gets. And they think that DEEPER equals OLDER. They think the deeper I go, the older it'll be, so they spend their time just digging and digging and digging, trying to get down deeper and find a bone that's deeper. Now, one thing they won't ever tell you is when they find a Pepsi-Cola can down there at the same depth as that dinosaur bone. That's right. You'll never find that in a scientific magazine. They'll tell you, oh, we found some teeth that belonged to the Nebraska man. But they were beside that Volkswagen also, that, some kids in college buried for some sorority or fraternity prank. And they found the teeth beside the VW, or the Coke bottle, or a Camel cigarette butt, or something they found down there. And they'll bring that up, and it'll splash across all the headlines in scientific journals. New man, Nebraska man, we found his teeth here. And they will, this is the literal truth, they'll actually find, someone's comb down there at the same depth, they'll find something else. Now, besides that, they'll also find human beings in the same depth as dinosaurs, and human beings live, millions of years after the dinosaurs became extinct. They won't tell you that either. As well as a certain system that, again, they've worked up, that these dinosaurs lived this long ago, and these only lived this long ago, and their time period didn't overlap each other, but yet they'll find bones side by side. But they won't tell you these things. All they'll tell you, and they're in scientific journals, and I've read them, so I know what I'm talking about, and we've taught you about the Nebraska man, so you know what I'm talking about. All they'll tell you is what they want you to know. And then they'll build their system upon this. It's very rare when you can find an honest scientist. I'd say an honest non-Christian scientist. Some Christians aren't honest, but then you have to question their Christian experience. But it's very rare when you'll find an honest one. Now, dear friends, he may be a good family man, and he may want to be honest, but that destroys all of what his teachers have taught him ever since freshman year in college, all the way through master's degree and PhD degree. And it destroys all the years that he's spent in postgraduate work, in understanding fossil remains and geology. It destroys all of that for him to have to admit some of these hoaxes that we have seen, as well as in the Paluxy riverbed in Texas, human footprints along with dinosaur footprints in the same riverbed. And they can't exist in the same riverbed, but they do. Which can only mean one thing, if you're honest, that the human beings of the past, some human beings, whether they were Cro-Magnon or not, we don't know, but some human being lived at the same time the dinosaurs did. And of course, the scientists don't believe that. They believe the dinosaurs had died out long before man ever came on the scene, or the dinosaurs would have destroyed man whenever he came on the scene. So we've got a couple of problems as far as this is concerned. Now, if you wonder, well, how did that Coke bottle or that Pepsi-Cola can get down as deep as maybe that dinosaur bone they found? There are a lot of ways to explain that, but one of the best and easiest, most believable ways to explain that is probably it got caught in some type of underground spring or underground river, and it was carried to a lower depth. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen an underground river before where it can come up from the ground. I've been to one, I remember, where the river was just flowing along and it was a regular sized river, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. It just went below the surface. And then it went several miles underground and came up again. Now, not all underground rivers are underground as well as above ground. Some of them do nothing but stay underground. But you can see how very easily something could have fallen in the river and got carried down to some deeper level there and buried, and there you'll find it with the dinosaur bone or whatever. But listen, the same thing could have been true with that dinosaur bone. Just because it's down that deep doesn't mean it's that old. Because just because the Coke bottle's down that deep, we certainly know it. They didn't have that back in the dinosaur days. That's just been invented this century. But yet if the Coke can, or the Coke bottle, got down there by means of an underground river, maybe the dinosaur bones got down there too. And of course, that's something we really don't need to have in our favor, because we've got the whole flood. And it completely churned up all the sediments of the earth and then redeposited it somewhere else and took things that were on the top and put them 50 feet down and brought things that were 10 feet down up to the top, just the reverse of what you'd see. So there's absolutely, unequivocally, no way that you can say that prior to the flood, the deeper that you go, the older the object, the older the date you can put to the object that you find. There's simply no way that you can do that because of the hydrostatic powers that the flood waters would have brought with them. They would have taken things on top, could have put them down deeper. They'd have taken bones of some animal that lived in some country and put him in some other country where we don't find that animal today. And people will say, well, it lived at that place at one time and became extinct, millions of years ago. Maybe he didn't live there at one time. Maybe the bones were carried there from another region. Maybe he did live there. You see, that's the whole thing. It's a guessing game. No one can say. None of us live there. And if we could really, if the fossil remains were our proof of setting up a whole scheme of history prior to the flood, then we can say, this animal lived at this date and he lived at this particular place. But since the flood rearranged everything, non-Christians as well as Christians are at a guessing game as far as where this particular animal really lived. Just because you find his remains in some country doesn't mean that's where the animal died. He could have died in the flood somewhere on the other side of the globe, and his remains, his bones, have been carried there. And for some reason, no one ever thinks of these things in geology. Or if they do, they want to just push them, out of their mind. It's too much trouble, it's too bothersome to them to have to go back to the Word of God, back to Genesis 6 to 9, and find out, now, let's quit kidding ourselves about all this Cro-Magnon business. Let's find out what really happened then. Because there is no better answer to the earth's ancient history than Noah's flood. Amen, that's right. There is no better answer to the earth's ancient history than Noah's flood. It is the answer to what happened then. It is the answer on why we find what geologists would say would be a new species, his remains buried somewhere down deep where it shouldn't be. The flood is the only thing that can explain this. The flood is the only thing that can explain things like the Grand Canyon. As a matter of fact, it's been noted by scientists that all of our major river systems in the world, at one time in their early history, all carried much more water than they now carry today. That's seen in the alluvial plains on both sides of the rivers, on all rivers, Nile River, Euphrates, Tigris, Mississippi River. You think, well, you know, the Mississippi River, what makes all that ground fertile all around the river? Well, you know, it used to flood there. Well, when did it ever flood? I mean, I'm talking about reaching to the regions that they say, where you've got really fertile soil, like in Mississippi, which is the territory along the rivers that's known as the Delta there. The Delta extends so many miles from the Mississippi River could never have flooded that far out of its banks over into what they call the Delta. They say that ground is fertile because the Mississippi flowed out of its banks one time, and a flood, you know, 100 years ago, and that's what made it fertile. No, the answer is all the tremendous volume of water that all the ancient rivers used to carry at the end of the flood, and it would have lasted for some time. All the water carried out of these rivers from the continental surfaces back into the ocean basins, back into the seas. There you've got a tremendous volume of water, and as a result you've got your fertile ground that you find around rivers and streams. Now another important question is, what happened to all of the flood water? We've been talking about the water itself. Remember, Genesis 7 says that it covered all the high hills under the whole expanse of heaven. So that means you've got 4,000 or 5,000 feet of water that covers the whole globe. Now we know where it came from. We answered that with the Genesis 7:11 text, the twofold origin source of the flood waters. We know the place from which it came, but it didn't go back to the Earth's atmosphere. It's not there today. And the atmosphere would have been at saturation point, so it couldn't have absorbed any more water. And we've never found yet a hole in the earth where it drained out the bottom. That would be my guess. If I didn't know anything about the Bible, someone pulled the plug. And it went out the back. Maybe that's what they believed when they believed in a flat earth, because you think a flat earth, no one could live upside down, you know. So someone pulled the plug, and that's where all the water went. But now we know that everyone lives upside down, except the people that live at the North Pole, or at least we live sideways. I don't know what everyone's laughing. Haven't you seen a globe before? You know we're living sideways. You're all standing like this. You ever been in any of those gravity houses before? That's what it's like. Gravity's holding us down, but we're all like this. You see, it's just like you're walking on the wall. You're seeing everything from a side angle, except everything else is on its side too. Now, if you're on the bottom, then you're walking almost on your head, really. But you'd be walking on the air on your head. And your feet, of course, would be dangling against the earth because you'd be upside down. Well, enough of that foolishness. Of course, no one pulled the plug. So what happened to all of the water? Well, two answers. I don't know how many we'll get to tonight. Well, we've only got two. We'll start with the first one. Two answers on where all the water went. Let's see, I'll start with the second one because I don't probably have enough time to get through the first one. So I'll start with the second one then. First of all, brilliant answers, I have to say so myself. A vast amount of the water is now locked up in the polar regions. Where'd all that water go? It's all locked up in the form of ice, glaciers, and snow in the polar regions. Now, you probably heard some of the ideas of some entrepreneurs who are wanting to tug icebergs from Antarctica bring it up to some dry country like Egypt, bring it up on land by ropes and pulleys, and let it sit there until it melts. Now, people are actually thinking about that. That's right. I know I've read some articles. You probably read some articles about it. They're actually thinking about, what would be the realism in bringing something like that up. Of course, it would melt, by the time you got it there, unless you got a big enough one. And you see, that's the point. Those icebergs are so huge, you probably could, if you could find some way to drag it from Antarctica to northern Africa to Libya, you probably could get it there. Now, a lot of it would melt, but you could probably get a lot of that iceberg there. Now, that's the whole point. Where did some of the water go? It's locked up. Antarctica, the Arctic region, the bottom, the top, the bottom of the poles, in the form of huge sheets of ice, thousands of feet thick and thousands of square miles broad and wide. Where'd all that water go when it came down? Remember, a lot of it, you see, after you've got the collapse of the water vapor canopy at both poles, remember it had to collapse and condense out as rain to begin with. But after a certain level, some fixed level of it had already condensed out as rain, then remember the temperatures began to fall. No rain could come anymore, so what would come then? Snow and ice. That would have been the result after that. And the rain that had fallen in those relatively warm seas at the time would take a little time after the temperatures had fallen, the mixing together of the warm and cool waters, for the cold waters to overcome the warm waters, turn to solid ice, which is what the Arctic region and the Antarctic region is composed of. Thousands of feet thick of ice. So that's one place where the water went. We'll stop there because I don't think I've got time to get into the other place where the waters went. Now we'll pick up with the other place next time, and we'll come back to this, the subject of the ice, when we look at glaciers.
For a complete